Hey everyone, welcome back to Unwrap with Shobs. And today with me, I have Pam, who has been working in teacher education and intersectionality and gender and sexual diversity. And she's here with us today to educate us about many things that we definitely need to know. So, hi, Pam, and thanks for joining us today.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here.
And we're so happy that you agreed to do this. So, I'm going to jump in right into the topic today. Yeah. So, let's begin with something very basic, which I think nowadays I've been seeing a lot of these reels on Instagram and TikTok, which are just shunning pronouns, right? They're just like, what is the big deal about it? And there's so many jokes around it. So let's begin with why are pronouns important in the first place?
I mean, it's a great question, and a huge conversation right now is really about pronouns. And I think pronouns are important because people have deemed them important part of their identity. Right? So if I have decided that this pronoun is representative of who I am as a person, then it's important that you respect that and that you use that pronoun. But I think on the flip side of that, I know a lot of queer and trans folks who say, let's just abolish the construct of gender completely. Like, forget about pronouns. Let's not even use them anymore because they just continue to uphold this system of gender that we're so entrenched in as a society. And so in that case, like, they're not important. But I think that what is important, and this is probably going to be a theme as we talk today, is this idea that we just need to listen and respect people's choices. So if you come across somebody who is in that space of saying, gender is not a system I want to partake in, then don't use pronouns for them. Use their name. If somebody comes and says, you know what, I identify this way, I use these pronouns, respect that. Use their pronouns. That's about their identity. And the best thing we can do is affirm, respect, and honor the way people want to represent themselves in the world. And if we can somehow support them, if they have gifted us with the knowledge of who they are through the pronouns that they are currently identifying with, awesome. Let's do that. That's not a hard thing to do. So I think that in some ways the conversation needs to move to, it's not a big deal. Let's just listen to people and respect them and move forward with how they want to be referred to.
Definitely. I think it creates a space of respect, right? It's just mutual respect at the end of the day. But to just counter this, I mean, this is not my opinion, but this is just what I'm seeing out there, right? So people are like, today it's pronouns, and tomorrow someone wants to say, I identify as a puppy or an animal or something like that. They just come back with absolute I would say backlashes that make no sense at all. What is your response to that?
I think it's people who need to really take a look at kind of their own relationship to gender. So why is it, what are you scared of around someone else's identity? How does that threaten you and your own identity? And how can you separate that? Because really those responses are grounded in transphobia. And so they're grounded in a space that says, I'm not seeing a trans person as a human. And I think that that's incredibly hurtful when we start to compare human beings to anything other than just being human. So I would say that those responses are really demeaning. I think that they are questioning the humanity of trans folks. And I think that that is just completely unacceptable.
100% agree with that. So pronouns, we've established why it's important. So I hope everyone makes a note of that. Now moving on. So as a queer person yourself, right? Can you state examples of casual homophobia that's just been normalized by the society? Like they don't even realize that it's not okay to say certain things, but it's just become a part and parcel of daily life, which is sad, but let's
really
break
sad.
it.
Yeah, but we're so entrenched in that, right? Like homophobia and transphobia have been part of our culture for so long that of course they become normalized. So I think that this idea of casual homophobia, it really manifests in microaggressions and cis heteronormativity. So cis heteronormativity is the system that normalizes cisgender identities and heterosexual relationships, right? Yeah. So if we make an assumption that these identities are given, that someone is born and they will grow up to identify with the gender they're assigned at birth, or that they're going to grow up to be in a heterosexual relationship, these assumptions are ones that reinforce cis heteronormativity. And so it's through that we, through the normalization of that system, that we don't really see certain microaggressions that might happen. So things like gender reveal parties, right? That's making a really big assumption about who this child's going to be. I'm trying to think of other examples like that. Comments about like inherent traits that are linked to gender. So of course, she likes that, she's a girl, or of course boys will be boys. So comments like this are perpetuating this harmful system, and this normalization of what it means to be entrenched in the gender binary. And even just this assumption, you say, oh, well, she's going to marry the boy next door, when you've got little 2-year-olds. And I think about that and think about the assumptions we're making. Like, that is casual homophobia that a lot of us don't see. And so that's something that we really need to work on, because these practices, like, they're just embedded right into the social and cultural fabric. And so they need to be examined. They need to be made strange, in that sense of being like, wait, why is that what I'm saying? Where does that come from? And how can I change my language and my behavior to be more open-minded? And I think that process of unlearning is going to be incredibly important moving forward.
For sure. So if we are in a situation or a room where casual homophobia is just thrown around, right? How do you suggest that we react to it? Do we just educate that person, or how do we just intervene at that very moment?
I mean, safety is so important. So I think the context of where you are is really important to how you intervene, or if you do. If you are not safe in that space, then I can understand a need to be silent. If it is within a space where you feel safe speaking up, where you feel safe calling people out, then there's a few things that I think can help with that conversation. So I just use the word calling out, but I think that what we want to try to do is call people into a conversation. So maybe question, well, what makes you think that? Or where does that come from? Or what if, it's the girl next door instead of the boy next door, just kind of planting those seeds of opening up the conversation. What about these other possibilities? And then the other thing that I think is a really great approach is just the comedic approach as well. Can we turn it around on them to make it so that they can see the ridiculousness of the statement in some way? So how do we kind of call it out in a way where we're all laughing together at the idea that this normative experience is so entrenched, right? And so that's where, like, satire, it plays such a good role in terms of how we can advance social justice conversations and advance conversations that are going to take us to new places and new possibilities and new futures, because I think that that's really what it's all about.
So moving forward, so I come from India originally, and we have a long way to go until we create like inclusive, safe spaces, right? And there's a notion that in developed countries, everything is fine. So for example, Canada or the United States, where like, that's why people live freely and they have the world to themselves. Is that true? Or do you feel that you still have battles to face before we create that space?
Oh, such a good question. I mean, there's so many places in the world where queer and trans identities are still criminalized. And I think that one of the things that we see in Canada is that we are incredibly lucky that our queer and trans realities are protected by law and by policy. And that hasn't been for that long, right? This is within the generations that are still very much here that activism has come about, and those laws, we've seen those laws change. But I think that there is a disconnect between policy and kind of practice in the ways that we see our lives in the world. So things like acceptance and inclusion are still battles that we're fighting, very much so. And so I'm going to talk within a Canadian context, because I know that there's tons of things happening in the United States as well that don't have those laws in place. There's tons of states where we're seeing anti-gay, anti-trans bills. I saw something just the other day that, in last year there was some absurd number, 500 or something anti-trans bills had been passed. So I do want to stay within a Canadian context, because I know that our legal rights are protected here. But I think that in order for queer and trans people to feel included in our public and cultural institutions, we just need to find ways to build more acceptance and inclusion, and through that education. So educational initiatives such as this one that you're doing, just talking to people. And so I think about this in terms of schooling, just because of the work that I do in teacher education, which is around schooling as a cultural institution. We have a lot of policies in place in our school boards here in Ontario, where I live, that protect our queer and trans kids. But the statistics and the research show that those kids still don't feel safe at school. So policies aren't enough. They're a great first step. And if you don't have the policies and laws in place yet, that's where energy needs to go. But knowing that we have those in place here and kids still don't feel safe means that there's a lot of work to do in the classroom specifically, in certain school communities. That's just educating people about 2S LGBTQ plus lives, so that there isn't a fear attached to those of us that are different or might have different experiences coming into those cultural institutions.
I mean, let's talk about GSA, right? So that is one way we could make schools a safe space. So what is GSA and why do we need it?
So GSA originally, when GSAs began to develop, they were called gay straight alliances. And that terminology has changed slightly since then. So at the time, it was an invitation to have folks who were questioning or who were allies to join the group as well, that by being part of the group, it didn't immediately mark you as queer. But as time has gone on, we've actually shifted to GSA, standing for Gender and Sexuality Alliance. And so these are student groups within schools that really serve two purposes. So the first is just to create that space for students to come together, to talk about diverse gender and sexuality, to find community, to find support. So that's a huge piece of the GSAs in schools. The other piece tends to be around advocacy and activism. So it's, again, student-led groups coming into their school saying, how do we address homophobia, transphobia? How do we celebrate pride? How do we bring about awareness? How do we do that education work so that we can feel safer here? So that our peers and our teachers can enter into these conversations with us. So that's what a GSA is. And the research is showing that schools that have GSAs actually have a much, students who have diverse gender and sexual identities feel much safer at school just because a GSA exists, whether they are part of it or not. They feel safer there knowing that that group and that program is available.
Definitely. And so again, so I think this urge to know, to learn, to educate yourself, I think in my experience comes from having someone in your life who's going through it, right? I think that gives you a better space, or that gives you an urge to actually want to learn. And I've had many instances where people don't want to get into it because they're like, it doesn't bother us. It's not in our house. So we really don't want to get into it. So let's talk about, by not creating an inclusive safe space, right? What effects does it have in terms of, let's say, literacy levels or the economic levels, or just the gross national happiness of a country or a society?
Well, yeah. So I think here again, like coming back to my personal experiences and like having my own kids. So I have a young child who, for a number of reasons, is not comfortable at school. They just don't feel safe there. And that has meant that this year they've actually missed 2/3 of the school year. And just not been in attendance for that amount of time. So we think about this more broadly in terms of feeling included, feeling safe at school, and what that means for children, and them not being able to be at school, like that ripple effect in terms of their education, in terms of how that impacts kind of our social understandings of, you're talking about the gross national happiness. When we are constantly coming up against a barrier to feeling safe, we're not feeling happy. In fact, we're miserable. And so again, like I'm now starting to repeat myself, but I'm thinking about like public schooling systems, and I'm thinking about this idea that if someone doesn't feel, there's lots of ways we can learn, right? So there's so many spaces we can learn in, and school is absolutely not the only space that creates inclusive learning spaces. And so there's gonna be lots of people who choose not to go to school for a lot of different reasons. But for a public education system, if someone would like to be in attendance, they should feel welcome there. They should feel expected there, and they should be able to go and attend more than 2/3 of the year so that they can live up to their fullest potential. And I think it's that potential and that queer futurity that I'm really thinking about with this question, right? we want queer and trans kids who are thriving, who grow up to be adults who are thriving, that their identities aren't ones that are pushed to the side, marginalized, or made to feel like they are not belonging in our world. And we want and ultimately that's what I think the goal is, to create that inclusive, safe environment as much as is possible. Like we know that safe spaces are also an illusion in that not everyone can feel safe at all times. But we want kids to be safe enough that they can participate. And so the ripple effect kind of through to adulthood is huge in that regard, I think.
When you don't have access to a good foundation, I'm not saying that schooling is the best foundation, but just in terms of then how do you, I mean, it's so much of self-learning that they have to do. And it's kind of sad that they don't have a community, or rather they feel that they don't have a community to go back to, right? So that is something definitely we should be working on. And so I'm going to wrap this up with the last two questions, right? So this is an ongoing battle or an ongoing conversation, right? So there are many days where you have your highs, you have your lows. How do you ensure that your mental battery is not drained? Because it's not easy. You can't always put up a fight. Sometimes you just want to sit back and just say, you know what, fuck it. But
absolutely. Yes. So me personally, reality TV, number one. That's how I recharge. That's how I recharge. Don't judge me.
I watch them too. 90 Day Fiancé,
I know, it's just such a nice escape. So no, I think that the biggest thing, and this is something I share with my students all the time, is that you have to find your people. You have to find people, like-minded people who are there to support you. Find your community, find your allies, find people who are willing to go on this journey with you and support you through the ups and the downs, as you've said, because some days are going to feel a lot harder. And on those hard days, it's okay to curl up and cry. And on the good days, it's good to celebrate. We do need to celebrate, and we need to celebrate queer joy and trans joy. So I want to see that joy uplifted more and more, because I think that the more that we can infuse our stories with joy, the more that we can kind of push that story of victimhood to the side, that we can say, no, we can thrive, and we don't need to focus on, the sad story or the story where we're not living up to our potential. So like queer joy, trans joy, community, allyship, that's how we continue to be activists with a sprinkle of reality TV.
And finally, for people who actually are interested, I think everyone should be, but for them to start off, right? As parents, we want to, what kind of books do we have to read to our kids, right? Or as adults, what kind of resources do we, seek out to actually become better at this topic, right? So I would love to know your recommendations and what you use in your daily life. Right?
So I'm going to disappoint you with this answer, and this is for all age groups. So I'm nervous to recommend specific titles, and I'm going to tell you why. There's so many incredible books out there. And I think that when we get fixated on this is the book I need, if that book is not available, if we can't find it at our local library, it costs too much to order it, then we can use that as an excuse as to why we're not going to pursue our learning. Well, that book wasn't available to me, so, oh well, let's move on. And so in the past 5 years, we've seen a huge shift. So 5 years ago, you came to me, I would say, here are the 5 books that exist for 5 to 6 year olds. Go read all of them. But that's no longer the case. The publishing world has seen the need for queer and trans representation in books for all age groups. And so the possibilities around what you can use as a resource are endless. And again, like we live in a time where you can go out and you can find those books. You're here on social media, like go on Book Talk or whatever it's called, go on Bookstagram, find those social justice accounts. Maybe it's picture book accounts specifically, or maybe it's, like really finding a specific genre. You can get like people who are really recommending things. And if you see a title with queer and trans characters, pick it up, because the more stories we can engage with, the more we can interrupt those stereotypes. So again, if I'm to recommend one book, and you read that story, and then that becomes the only story of queer and trans folks, then that's just as problematic as not having read the book. What we need is to have many stories, many diverse stories of queer and trans characters, that help us to understand that there are so many incredible diverse experiences that exist for queer and trans folks around the globe. So go out there and find the books that work for you, that are available to you, and see if you can, whether it's going on YouTube and getting a read aloud, if you can't find it anywhere else. But yeah, that would kind of be my answer is start with what's available to you. See what you can find and start there, and then circle out from there, because there's so many possibilities around what you can find. And to listen and not dismiss folks. I think that this is the biggest thing that happens, is that there's so many people willing to share their stories, and they do it, and we have the platforms and the tools to be able to do that right now. But what we don't have is people listening. And so if you have the power to just take a minute and listen with an open heart and an open mind, and to say, this isn't my experience of the world, but I honor and respect that that is your truth, and I want to hear that. And I believe that can make a world of difference in terms of opening up conversations between maybe polarizing ideas, people who hold polarizing ideas, rather.
Thanks, Pam. Yeah, I think that was like a beautiful conclusion. But yeah, I hope this information has been really helpful for all of you. And I hope you take this forward. This is your first step in educating yourself. And as we just said, there's so much more that you could learn. And just, as I said, be nice, you all. It's not that hard. But thank you so much, Pam. Thank you so much.
This has been so fun. No problem. Have fun, everyone. Go out there, learn more, find some incredible accounts to follow, find some amazing books to read, and just know that wherever you are in your journey is exactly where you're meant to be, and that we are all on a journey, and that gender and sexuality is changing so incredibly fast, and that it is fluid. So where you are today is completely different than where you'll be tomorrow or where you will be in 5 years, and that is true of all of us. So just keep moving forward, knowing that change is part of being human. That we are adapting, and that we are changing, and that we are all always becoming.